Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. This psychological thriller follows the sudden disappearance of Megan Harris from the small, idyllic town of Brookhaven. Her husband, Chris Harris, a seemingly loving and devoted partner, becomes the focus of suspicion as hidden layers of their marriage are revealed. What begins as a simple missing person case spirals into a web of deceit, manipulation, and dark secrets. Each chapter uncovers chilling twists and motivations that leave readers questioning every character's intentions. Chapter 1. The Day Megan Vanished. The morning sun crept over the sleepy town of Brookhaven as Chris Harris stared at the empty side of the bed where his wife Megan should have been. Their quaint suburban home felt unsettlingly quiet, the usual hum of their morning routine absent. Chris brushed off the unease as he got ready for work, assuming Megan was out running an errand or taking an early walk. Hours passed with no word from Megan. Chris's worry began to gnaw at him. He texted, called, and even checked with her closest friends. Nothing. By evening, concern turned into panic. Megan had never been the type to just disappear without a trace. He drove through the town, revisiting all the places she frequented. The cafe she loved, the park where she often went to clear her head, even the library. No sign of her. When Chris finally reported Megan missing to the Brookhaven police, the officer on duty, Detective Emily Grayson, seemed more curious than concerned. She asked the usual questions about Megan's habits, their marriage, whether they'd had any recent arguments. Chris assured her they were happy, content even. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. Was their marriage really as perfect as he portrayed it? As the investigation kicked off, the first hints of something amiss began to emerge. Megan's closest friends shared whispers of her recent mood changes, a growing sense of unease she hadn't explained. Some suggested she'd been stressed, others hinted at something darker, something she had confided only to a select few. Chris found himself at the center of the investigation, his every move scrutinized. By the end of the chapter, Chris is left alone in their dimly lit living room, staring at a photo of him and Megan, wondering how everything could have unraveled so quickly. His mind churns with questions, doubts, and a nagging fear that perhaps he knows more about Megan's disappearance than he's willing to admit, even to himself. Chapter 2. The Perfect Life, Cracked Beneath the Surface. Brookhaven was a town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. Megan Harris was known as the charming, intelligent woman who always had a smile ready and a kind word for anyone who crossed her path. On the outside, she and Chris seemed to live the ideal suburban life, cozy house, successful careers, and a marriage envied by many. But the more Detective Grayson dug into their lives, the more cracks began to show. As Chris tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in the days following Megan's disappearance, the town's whispers grew louder. At first, they pitied him, a man grieving his missing wife, worried sick and doing his best to cooperate with the investigation. But pity soon gave way to suspicion. Why did Chris seem so composed in public, so calm under pressure? Why did Megan's friends describe a woman who had become increasingly unhappy over the past year, a woman who might have been hiding something? Detective Grayson honed in on these inconsistencies. As she questioned Chris at the station, her tone was friendly, but laced with a subtle edge. She wanted to know more about their marriage, how they met, what Megan was like behind closed doors, whether they had any major fights recently. Chris's answers were smooth, almost rehearsed, as he painted a picture of marital bliss. He emphasized that they rarely argued and spent most of their free time together, enjoying quiet evenings at home or dinners with friends. It was the image of a perfect partnership. But Grayson's instincts told her otherwise. During her interviews with Megan's colleagues, she learned about a side of Megan that didn't quite match Chris's narrative. A few months before she disappeared, Megan had started confiding in a coworker, like hinting at troubles at home. There were mentions of Chris's mood swings, his tendency to withdraw when things didn't go his way, and a growing emotional distance between them. Megan had even joked about writing everything down, keeping a diary of secrets that might one day save her if things got worse. The coworker had dismissed it as lighthearted banter at the time. Now, in hindsight, it felt like a clue. The investigation took another turn when Detective Grayson visited Megan's favorite spots around Brookhaven. At the small cafe where Megan often spent her afternoons, the barista recalled a recent conversation. Megan had been unusually quiet, sipping her coffee while staring out the window. When asked if everything was okay, Megan had responded with a cryptic smile and said, "I'm figuring things out. Sometimes you just have to take matters into your own hands." Meanwhile, Chris's demeanor began to change as the days stretched on with no sign of Megan. The initial calm he displayed cracked under the weight of relentless media attention and the invasive questions from both the police and the public. On the surface, he played the role of the concerned husband, organizing search efforts and making tearful pleas for information on television. But behind closed doors, the strain was showing. He was barely sleeping, and when he did, his dreams were haunted by flashes of memories, some sweet, others bitter. Moments from his marriage that painted a picture not of harmony, but of subtle tension and unspoken resentment. The turning point came when Detective Grayson found Megan's diary of secrets. Hidden inside an old chest in the attic, the diary was a meticulous record of Megan's thoughts over the past year. Each entry was written with precision, starting off light, but gradually descending into darker territory. In the early pages, Megan gushed about her love for Chris and the life they'd built together. But as time went on, the entries grew colder. She wrote about feeling trapped, about Chris's controlling tendencies and his habit of gaslighting her when she tried to express her concerns. There were passages where Megan admitted she was scared of what might happen if she ever tried to leave. The final entry was the most chilling of all. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." When Detective Grayson confronted Chris with the diary, he seemed genuinely shocked, claiming to know nothing about it. His eyes scanned the pages in disbelief, his voice trembling as he insisted Megan was always exaggerating, prone to dramatizing even the smallest issues. But the detective remained unconvinced. There was something off about Chris, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but she was determined to find out what it was. As the chapter closes, Chris finds himself alone in their house, sitting in the dark, staring at the empty space where Megan used to be. The memories flood back. Happy times, bitter arguments, the quiet moments when they simply existed side by side, pretending everything was fine. But now, with the diary casting a long shadow over him, Chris begins to wonder if Megan had been planning something all along, something he never saw coming. He begins to question not just what happened to her, but who she really was. Because if the woman he loved could hide so much from him, what else was she capable of? The chapter ends with Chris making a phone call, one that could change everything, depending on who picks up on the other end. Chapter 3. The Facade Crumbles. The discovery of Megan's diary sent shockwaves through Brookhaven, turning a once straightforward missing person case into a full-blown media circus. Chris Harris, who had been struggling to maintain his composure, was now portrayed as the likely villain in every news headline. The town that had once supported him with sympathetic glances and comforting words now watched him with narrowed eyes, whispers following him wherever he went. The diary became a central piece of evidence, but there was one problem: it was incomplete. The entries ended abruptly, leaving Detective Grayson with a nagging feeling that something crucial was missing. She couldn't shake the thought that the last few pages had been deliberately removed or hidden. But who had done it? Megan, to cover her tracks, or Chris, to bury a damning revelation? Meanwhile, the pressure on Chris was mounting. The stress of the investigation and the relentless questions from the press began to take a toll on his once steady demeanor. At work, his colleagues avoided him, their conversations stopping the moment he entered the room. Friends who once stood by his side were now distant, hesitant to associate with a man increasingly viewed as a prime suspect. One evening, as Chris returned home from yet another grueling day of questioning at the police station, he found a surprise waiting for him: a box sitting on his front porch. There was no note, no return address, just his name scrawled across the top in familiar handwriting. His heart raced as he carried the box inside and placed it on the kitchen table. It was sealed tightly, almost as if someone wanted to ensure its contents remained a secret until the right moment. When Chris finally opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were dozens of photographs, candid shots of him and Megan over the years. But these weren't the kind of photos he was expecting. They weren't of holidays, parties, or happy moments. Instead, they captured Megan looking somber, distant, sometimes even frightened. In some of the images, she wasn't even aware of the camera, her expression vacant as she stared off into space. The photos were accompanied by a handwritten note from Megan. The truth is always hiding in plain sight. As Chris sifted through the photos, a creeping sense of dread washed over him. He didn't remember taking most of these pictures, yet there they were, moments from their life together frozen in time, showing a side of Megan he had never truly noticed, or perhaps had chosen to ignore. But one photo in particular stood out. Megan standing in front of an old, rundown cabin deep in the woods. He didn't recognize the place, but something about it felt eerily familiar. Chris's mind raced with questions. Where was this cabin? Why would Megan take a photo of herself there? And more importantly, what did she mean by the truth is hiding in plain sight? Determined to find answers, Chris took the photo to Detective Grayson. But instead of finding relief in her help, he was met with more suspicion. Grayson, who had already started piecing together a different narrative, began to view the photo as part of an elaborate setup. Convenient, isn't it? She said, narrowing her eyes at Chris. First the diary, now these photos. It's almost as if Megan was planning this all along. Her words stung, but they also planted a seed of doubt in Chris's mind. What if Megan had orchestrated her own disappearance, setting him up as the perfect fall guy? As outrageous as the idea seemed, the more Chris thought about it, the more plausible it became. After all, the Megan he knew had always been methodical, precise, and capable of surprising him in ways he never anticipated. Grayson decided to look into the cabin from the photo. After some digging, she discovered that the cabin was on the outskirts of Brookhaven, a place Megan had visited several times in the past few months under the guise of needing time to think. The property had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the middle of a dense forest. Locals avoided it, spinning stories of hauntings and strange occurrences, but Megan had clearly been there. What was she doing in such a remote, forgotten place? The investigation shifted focus to the cabin, with Grayson and her team deciding to conduct a thorough search. Chris, against the detective's wishes, insisted on joining them. If there's something there that can help find Megan, I need to see it, he argued, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and fear. When they arrived, the cabin was exactly as the photographs suggested, decrepit, half swallowed by the encroaching woods, and eerily silent. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust-coated furniture, broken windows, and rotting wood gave the place a haunted atmosphere. Yet amid the squalor, Grayson noticed something out of place. A single, clean chair placed in the center of the room, facing a wall covered with maps, notes, and photographs. It was a makeshift investigation board, and at the center of it was Megan. The wall was plastered with detailed plans, timelines, and documents, evidence that Megan had been conducting her own investigation. The photos showed different locations around Brookhaven, and the notes referenced names Chris had never heard before. One map had a route circled in red ink, leading from their home to this very cabin. The more Grayson examined the board, the clearer it became. Megan was digging into something deep, something dangerous, and she had been leaving breadcrumbs for someone to follow. Whether it was for Chris, the police, or someone else entirely remained a mystery. As Chris stood frozen in front of the board, a new wave of doubt crashed over him. Was this a cry for help, or had Megan been deliberately setting him up, knowing that he'd be the prime suspect? And what was she investigating that required such secrecy? Before they could piece everything together, a loud crash echoed from the back of the cabin. Chris and Grayson exchanged startled glances before rushing toward the source of the noise. They found nothing but shattered glass from a broken window, yet the sense of being watched lingered in the air. Someone or something had been there, perhaps even waiting for them. As the chapter ends, Chris finds himself questioning everything he thought he knew about Megan. The realization begins to sink in. that this mystery isn't just about finding his wife, it's about uncovering the dark truths she buried beneath their seemingly perfect life. And with every step he takes deeper into this twisted puzzle, he can't shake the growing fear that maybe Megan was always one step ahead of him, leading him into a trap he'll never escape. Chapter 4: Unraveling the Web. The discovery of the investigation board in the abandoned cabin set off a wave of confusion and paranoia that rippled through Chris's mind. Megan's meticulous notes, timelines, and photographs pointed to a hidden life she had carefully concealed from everyone, even him. But the more Chris thought about it, the less he could understand why. What had driven Megan to such extremes? What was she investigating, and how did it connect to her disappearance? Detective Grayson was growing increasingly wary of Chris. The more she uncovered, the more she suspected that Megan's disappearance was the result of a carefully orchestrated game, one that either Chris or Megan had planned in advance. But as she dug deeper, the threads became harder to untangle. Was this a scheme to frame Chris, or was it a desperate attempt by Megan to escape something more sinister? The investigation took a darker turn when Grayson's team found something chilling at the cabin, an envelope tucked inside one of the floorboards. It was addressed to Chris in Megan's handwriting. Grayson read it first, but the contents were far from what she expected. The letter was a cryptic mix of affection, guilt, and warning. Megan wrote about their love in poetic terms, describing their relationship as a beautiful prison, a place where she once felt safe but later felt trapped. She hinted at secrets Chris never knew about, things she had done to protect herself and possibly him. The letter ended with a single ominous line: "Be careful who you trust. They're closer than you think." For Chris, reading the letter was like stepping into a nightmare. Megan's words were laced with double meanings, and every phrase seemed to carry a hidden threat. Was she trying to protect him, or was this another part of her twisted game? The more he read, the more he began to question his own sanity. Had he missed the warning signs all along, or had Megan manipulated him from the very beginning? Grayson, however, wasn't convinced by the letter's emotional tone. To her, it read more like a confession wrapped in riddles. She couldn't shake the feeling that Megan was leading them somewhere specific, pushing them toward a particular conclusion. But what was it? The mystery deepened when Grayson expanded her search into Megan's past. She discovered that Megan had been in contact with a private investigator for months, someone who specialized in exposing hidden affairs, financial fraud, and blackmail schemes. When Grayson tracked down the investigator, he was surprisingly forthcoming. Megan had hired him to dig into someone close to her, though she never revealed who. The investigator described Megan as paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder and asking if he was onto her yet. When pressed, he admitted he assumed he was Chris, but Megan never confirmed it. At this point, Chris was teetering on the edge. With each new revelation, he felt as though he was falling further down a rabbit hole, unsure if he was the hunter or the prey. The investigator's testimony left Chris grappling with the notion that Megan's fear wasn't entirely directed at him. Could she have been running from someone else, someone they both knew? Meanwhile, the townspeople had fully turned against Chris. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now avoided eye contact, whispering behind his back. The media painted him as a calculating husband with something to hide, and the online rumor mill was relentless, with wild theories spreading like wildfire. Each time Chris left the house, he felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching, judging. But Chris couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in his mind. What if Megan was still alive, out there somewhere, pulling the strings? The idea was almost unbearable, but it was also the only thing that kept him going. He needed to find out the truth, whatever it was, even if it meant uncovering the darkest parts of their relationship. Determined to confront the growing cloud of suspicion and piece together what Megan was really up to, Chris decided to retrace her steps, starting with the private investigator's findings. He began by going through Megan's financial records, searching for any unexplained expenses or transfers. To his surprise, he found several large cash withdrawals over the past year, all made at times when Megan claimed to be out shopping or running errands. It wasn't like her to be so secretive about money, and the amounts were too large to ignore. As Chris followed the trail of withdrawals, he was led to a rundown part of town, an area Megan had no reason to visit. After days of searching, he finally located a nondescript storage unit listed under a fake name. Inside, he found what could only be described as a safe house. There were survival supplies, a burner phone, a stash of fake IDs, and detailed documents on several people in Brookhaven. Megan had been preparing for something big. But what? At the center of it all was a name Chris didn't recognize. Daniel Shaw. The documents suggested that Megan had been investigating this man for months, but no one in town seemed to know who he was. The name appeared over and over, connected to various accounts and locations, but always under different aliases. The more Chris dug, the more this Daniel Shaw seemed like a ghost, someone who lived in the shadows, pulling strings from afar. But the most chilling discovery was a final note from Megan hidden beneath the stack of documents. It was brief but clear. He knows everything. I couldn't run fast enough. If you find this, I'm already gone. With his mind reeling, Chris brought everything to Detective Grayson. But instead of reassuring him, her reaction only deepened his fears. Grayson's expression turned cold as she scanned the documents, her fingers tightening on the edges of the paper. "You need to be honest with me, Chris," she said, her voice low. "Who is Daniel Shaw, and why do I have a feeling you know more than you're letting on?" The accusation struck Chris like a blow. He swore he had no idea who this man was, but Grayson's suspicion was unwavering. She was convinced that either Chris was hiding something, or he was being manipulated into playing a role in a much larger, more sinister plot. As the chapter closes, Chris stands alone outside the storage unit, staring at the darkening sky. The lines between victim and perpetrator have blurred beyond recognition, and Chris can no longer tell if he's a pawn in someone else's game, or if Megan was trying to protect him from something far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The sense of isolation tightens around him as he realizes that everyone, from the police to the public, has turned against him. Even worse, the one person who could explain everything is either dead or hiding in the shadows, watching every move he makes. Chapter 5: The Shadow of Daniel Shaw. Chris's life was spiraling out of control. The pressure, suspicion, and unraveling of everything he thought he knew were becoming unbearable. The mysterious name Daniel Shaw haunted him, a specter that seemed to be lurking in the dark corners of his mind, always just out of reach. Every time he thought he had a grasp on the situation, something new would surface to knock him off balance. Detective Grayson was now fully focused on this new lead. The connection between Megan and Daniel Shaw was undeniable, yet there was no trace of this man in any official records. He was like a ghost, someone who existed on paper but not in reality. Grayson's investigation into Shaw only led to dead ends: fake addresses, fraudulent IDs, and untraceable bank accounts. Shaw was clearly a professional, someone with the resources and skills to remain invisible. But why would Megan be involved with someone like that? And what had she uncovered that was so dangerous? While Grayson and her team combed through the scant evidence they had, Chris's desperation led him to take matters into his own hands. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait for the police to piece everything together. The tension between him and Grayson had grown hostile. She was convinced that Chris either knew more than he was letting on, or was complicit in Megan's disappearance. Feeling isolated and cornered, Chris decided to start from the one lead he had: the storage unit and the documents he found. Among Megan's meticulous notes were several mentions of a local charity event that she had been attending regularly. It was a seemingly innocuous affair, a weekly community gathering aimed at raising funds for a children's hospital. But Megan's notes hinted at something more sinister happening behind the scenes. She'd written cryptic references to shadow meetings that took place after the charity events, involving certain high-profile attendees, including business owners, local politicians, and a mysterious figure who always remained in the background. Chris realized that Megan must have been using these events to gather information, digging into something that had put her in grave danger. With no other options, Chris decided to attend one of these events, hoping to find someone who could lead him to Daniel Shaw. It was held at an upscale venue on the edge of town, the kind of place where the wealthy mingled and put on appearances of benevolence while keeping their darker secrets hidden. The night was filled with pleasant chatter, clinking glasses, and forced smiles, but Chris wasn't there to socialize. He scanned the crowd, looking for anything out of place, any sign that someone there might be involved in whatever Megan had uncovered. It didn't take long for him to spot something unusual. A man, dressed in an unassuming suit, stood near the back of the room, watching everything with an unnervingly calm demeanor. He didn't mingle or participate in conversations. He simply observed, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Chris's instincts told him this man was no ordinary attendee. There was something in his eyes that spoke of cold calculation and hidden motives. Chris approached him, feigning casual curiosity, and struck up a conversation. The man introduced himself as Richard Steele, but Chris could tell this was an alias. As they talked, Chris dropped subtle hints about his missing wife, testing to see if the man would react. Steele remained composed, but his eyes gave away a flicker of recognition when Chris mentioned Megan's name. Chris knew he had struck a nerve. "I've heard about your situation," Steele said, his voice smooth and measured. "Tragic, really, but sometimes people disappear because they get too close to things they shouldn't." The words sent a chill down Chris's spine. This man knew something. But before Chris could press him further, Steele leaned in and whispered, "If you're looking for answers, I'd suggest you stop digging. Some truths are better left buried." With that, Steele turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Chris with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Megan had been playing a dangerous game, and whatever she'd uncovered had drawn the attention of people far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Chris couldn't tell if Steele was a threat, a warning, or both, but he knew he was getting closer to the truth. As the night wore on, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he thought he saw shadows shifting, figures moving just beyond the edges of his vision. Paranoia gripped him, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He needed to find out who Daniel Shaw was and what connection he had to Megan's disappearance. The next morning, Chris received an unexpected visit at his home. It was Grayson, and she didn't look happy. "We found something," she said curtly, holding up a grainy security camera photo. The image showed Megan in a tense conversation with a man outside a coffee shop 3 weeks before she disappeared. The man's face was partially obscured, but there was no mistaking it. It was Richard Steele. "I thought you might recognize him," Grayson said, her tone laced with suspicion. Chris's heart raced. He was now directly linked to someone involved in Megan's mysterious activities. But before he could respond, Grayson dropped another bombshell. "We traced Steele's activities back several years, and he has ties to a series of disappearances, blackmail schemes, and financial crimes across multiple states. The name Daniel Shaw pops up in connection with all of them, but no one's ever been able to pin him down. Whoever Shaw is, he's always a step ahead, using people like Steele as his foot soldiers." Chris felt the room spinning. He was now entangled in a web of crime and conspiracy that stretched far beyond what he ever imagined, and at the center of it all was Megan, a woman he thought he knew, but who had been hiding a labyrinth of secrets. As Grayson laid out her findings, Chris realized that Megan's disappearance was no accident. She had been actively hunted, whether by Shaw, Steele, or both. The clues Megan left behind were breadcrumbs, leading Chris deeper into a dangerous world he was ill-prepared for. But it was too late to turn back now. Chris was in too deep, and the only way out was through. But just as they were piecing everything together, a call came in that would shatter everything Chris thought he knew. The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate. "You're getting too close, Chris. If you want to see Megan again, you'll stop looking. The next time you dig where you don't belong, it'll be her blood on your hands." The line went dead, leaving Chris frozen in fear. But this wasn't just a threat. It was a message, a challenge from someone who knew exactly where Megan was. For the first time, Chris felt a surge of anger and determination. He was done playing by their rules. If they thought they could scare him off, they were wrong. He would find Megan, no matter the cost, even if it meant stepping into the lion's den himself. As the chapter closes, Chris stands on the precipice of a deadly game, with his every move watched and controlled by forces far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The shadow of Daniel Shaw looms larger than ever, and the lines between friend and enemy blur as Chris prepares to take matters into his own hands. The stage is set for a confrontation that will reveal the true nature of the tangled web Megan found herself caught in, and whether Chris has the strength to untangle it before it's too late. 6. Into the abyss. The chilling phone call rattled Chris to his core, but it also hardened his resolve. The voice on the other end was cold, calculated, and eerily familiar. But Chris couldn't place it. He replayed it in his mind over and over, trying to extract some clue, something that would give him a lead, but there was nothing. Just the ominous warning that Megan's life was in his hands. For the first time, Chris began to realize that this was more than just a mystery about his missing wife. It was a battle of wills, a game designed by someone who was always one step ahead. Detective Grayson, despite her skepticism, knew they were running out of time. Megan's trail was growing colder, and with each passing day, the odds of finding her alive diminished. But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that Megan wasn't just another victim. She was a player in this twisted game. The problem was, he still didn't understand the rules, and with every move he made, he felt more like a pawn being manipulated. Chris decided to dive deeper into Megan's hidden world, starting with her digital life. He knew she had been paranoid about her privacy, using encrypted apps and burner phones, but there had to be something she missed, some crack in the armor that would give him a way in. After hours of searching, Chris found a hidden partition on Megan's laptop, buried beneath layers of security. It was filled with encrypted files, most of which were indecipherable. But there was one file that stood out, an audio recording labeled, "Listen if you find this." His heart pounded as he pressed play. Megan's voice filled the room, shaky but determined. "Chris, if you're hearing this, it means I couldn't stop them. It means they've found me, or I had to disappear. I know you're probably angry, confused, but please understand, I did this to protect you. They'll come after you next, but you need to stay ahead of them. They don't want money, they want control." Daniel Shaw isn't just one man. He's an idea, a network of people who thrive on chaos, who profit from secrets and fear. I got too close, and now I'm paying the price. Megan's voice broke, and Chris could hear the fear creeping in. "I thought I could handle it, that I could outsmart them. But I was wrong. If you want to survive, you have to stop trusting anyone, even the people you think are on your side. Grayson, Steele, even people you knew growing up, they're all part of the game. Shaw recruits them, manipulates them, and when they're no longer useful, he discards them. You need to find the one weak link in their chain. There's always someone who wants out, someone who made a deal they regret. Find them, and you might just find me." The recording ended abruptly, leaving Chris in stunned silence. His suspicions about Grayson, Steele, and everyone else were suddenly magnified tenfold. Was Megan right? Was everyone around him a player in this game, guiding him toward an inevitable conclusion that he couldn't control? Chris knew he couldn't trust anyone. He had to follow his own path, even if it meant going against the very people who were supposedly helping him. He went back through the documents he'd found in the storage unit, that focusing on the names and connections Megan had outlined. One name kept coming up, a Laura Barnes, a woman who had vanished from Brookhaven under mysterious circumstances years ago. According to Megan's notes, Laura had been involved with some of the same people Megan was investigating. The trail was old, but Chris had a gut feeling that Laura was the key to understanding what had happened to Megan. Chris tracked down Laura's last known address, a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for years, but as Chris explored the crumbling structure, he found evidence that someone had been there recently. There were fresh footprints in the dust, and a corner of the living room had been set up as a makeshift camp, complete with a sleeping bag and empty food containers. Someone was hiding here, and Chris was determined to find out who. As he continued searching, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the floorboards. Inside was a journal, worn, tattered, and filled with entries that spanned years. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, but the contents were a gold mine of information. Laura had been documenting everything, her fears, her suspicions, and most importantly, her connection to Daniel Shaw. According to the journal, Laura had been recruited into Shaw's network, coerced into participating in illegal activities under the threat of violence. But as she became more entangled, she realized she wasn't the only one. Shaw's web stretched far beyond Brookhaven, ensnaring dozens of people who had either made a deal with him or had something to hide. But there was one entry that stood out, dated just a few weeks before Laura disappeared. She wrote about a meeting with a woman who was trying to get out, someone who was desperate enough to betray Shaw if it meant gaining her freedom. The woman was described as resourceful, determined, and utterly terrified. Chris's breath caught in his throat as he read the description. It was Megan. Laura had been planning to help Megan escape, but before they could finalize their plan, Laura went off the grid. According to the journal, Laura was supposed to deliver a crucial piece of evidence to Megan, something that could expose Shaw's entire operation, but she never made it. The journal ended abruptly, leaving Chris with more questions than answers. What was the evidence, and where was Laura now? Chris was jolted out of his thoughts by the creak of a floorboard behind him. He spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. The house was silent, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He could feel eyes on him, someone watching from the shadows. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. If he was going to survive this, he needed to stay one step ahead. He grabbed the journal and left the house, but as he walked out, he noticed a car parked down the road. It was unmarked, the windows tinted dark. It hadn't been there when he arrived. Someone was following him, someone who didn't want him getting any closer to the truth. Back at his house, Chris locked himself in and began poring over the journal again, hoping to find some hidden clue. But as the night wore on, exhaustion set in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak in the house sent his heart racing. He knew he was getting closer, but with each step forward, the danger grew. Shaw's network was vast, and Chris had no idea how deep it went, or who might be lurking in the darkness, ready to strike. Just as he was about to turn in for the night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It simply read, "Time's running out, Chris. Make the wrong move and Megan's blood is on your hands. You're already too deep. Stop now, or you'll never find her." But Chris was done being scared. He wasn't going to stop. He was going to find Megan, no matter who stood in his way. He knew this wasn't just about rescuing her anymore. This was about exposing the truth, tearing down the twisted game that Shaw had built, and freeing both himself and Megan from the grip of something far more dangerous than he ever imagined. As the chapter closes, Chris gears up for what's coming, fully aware that every move he makes could be his last. The darkness around him feels alive, pressing in from all sides, but he's ready. The game has changed, and Chris is no longer just a pawn. He's about to become the hunter. Chapter 7: The Hunter and the Hunted. Chris had crossed a line. There was no going back. He was no longer simply a desperate husband searching for his missing wife. He was a man on a mission, ready to challenge the dark forces that had swallowed Megan whole. The message he received last night echoed in his mind. Time's running out, Chris. Make the wrong move, and Megan's blood is on your hands. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning that someone was watching his every move. He needed to act fast, but he also knew that being reckless could cost him everything. Chris decided to pursue the only lead left, the meeting Megan had scheduled with Laura Barnes before she vanished. According to Laura's journal, they were supposed to meet at an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a notorious spot, long rumored to be used for illegal dealings and secret gatherings. If this was where they had planned to exchange information, it was likely that someone else had been watching too. As Chris prepared to leave, he took precautions. He changed cars, choosing a nondescript sedan he'd rented under a fake name, and kept his phone turned off to avoid being tracked. He even left his wallet behind, anything that could identify him if he ran into trouble. He wasn't just stepping into a warehouse. He was stepping into a trap, and he needed to be ready. The warehouse loomed like a beast from another world, its rusting frame and shattered windows exuding a sense of decay. The area around it was desolate. No lights, no traffic, nothing but the cold wind howling through the empty streets. Chris parked his car a few blocks away and approached on foot, slipping through the shadows. He kept his senses sharp, eyes scanning every corner, ears tuned to even the faintest sound. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of twisted metal and forgotten machinery. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind felt like an omen. Chris moved silently, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He knew he wasn't alone. The sense of being watched was palpable, but he wasn't about to be intimidated. As he crept deeper into the warehouse, he found what he was looking for, a small, hidden room that was boarded up and concealed behind stacks of old crates. It was a room designed for secrecy, the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. The door was slightly ajar, and Chris carefully pushed it open. Inside, the room was barren except for a dusty table and a few scattered papers. But it was what was written on the wall that made his blood run cold. Scrawled in red paint, or was it blood, were the words, "Trust no one." Beneath them was a crude sketch of an eye, drawn in a way that made it feel like it was staring straight into Chris's soul. Megan had been here. He was sure of it. But what had she discovered that was so dangerous it forced her into hiding? Chris rifled through the papers on the table. Most of them were unintelligible, filled with codes and symbols that made no sense. But one document caught his attention. It was a list of names, all connected to different towns, dates, and addresses. Chris recognized some of the names. They were people who had gone missing over the years, their disappearances unsolved. Megan's name was on the list too, with the date of her disappearance circled in bold red ink. But there was something else. Next to each name was a dollar amount, as if they had been bought or traded like commodities. And there, at the bottom of the list, was a name that sent a chill down his spine. Daniel Shaw. Before Chris could make sense of what he was seeing, he heard a soft shuffle behind him. He whipped around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to pulse, alive with hidden eyes. He knew this was no coincidence. He had been led here for a reason, but he wasn't sure if it was to find answers or to be silenced. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he was so close now. He couldn't walk away. Suddenly, the lights in the warehouse flickered on, flooding the space with a harsh, artificial glow. Chris's heart pounded as he realized he was trapped. From the darkness, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. Then, from behind the stacks of crates, Richard Steele emerged, his face twisted into a mocking grin. "I told you to stop digging, Chris," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Chris clenched his fists, anger boiling over. "Where's Megan? What did you do to her?" Steele shook his head, almost pitying him. "It's not what I did, Chris. It's what she did. She made choices, dangerous choices, and now she's paying the price. But don't worry, you're about to join her in the game." Before Chris could react, more figures emerged from the shadows, men dressed in black, their faces hidden behind masks. They moved with military precision, encircling Chris, cutting off any chance of escape. Chris's mind raced. He had underestimated the scale of what he was up against. This wasn't just a few corrupt players. This was a well-organized operation, and he was deep in their lair. Steele stepped closer, his voice calm and menacing. "You were never going to win, Chris. This game isn't about finding your wife. It's about control, controlling information, controlling people, controlling fear. Megan was smart, but she wasn't smart enough to outplay us. And now you're stuck in her place and playing a game you can't possibly understand." Chris felt a surge of defiance. He wasn't going down without a fight. He took a step toward Steele, but before he could make a move, a sharp pain shot through his side. He gasped, clutching his ribs as a searing heat spread through his body. One of the masked men had struck him with a baton, and Chris could feel his strength draining. But even as he doubled over in pain, he refused to back down. Steele crouched beside him, his voice a low whisper. "This is what happens when you dig too deep. You should have listened to the warnings. But don't worry, Chris. I'll make sure Megan knows how much you cared before she disappears for good." Chris's vision blurred as he fought to stay conscious. He knew he was losing, but in that moment something snapped inside him. He couldn't let them win. With every ounce of strength he had left, Chris lunged at Steele, knocking him off balance. The room erupted into chaos as the masked men closed in, but Chris didn't care anymore. He was fueled by pure rage, driven by the need to save Megan at any cost. In the scuffle, Chris managed to grab one of the masked men's weapons, a taser, and jabbed it into Steele's side. Steele screamed, collapsing in pain, and Chris used the distraction to break free. He bolted for the exit, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He didn't know where he was running to, but he knew he had to get out of that warehouse before they regrouped. Chris burst out into the night, gasping for breath, his mind racing. He had no car, no phone, and no plan. But he had something more important. He had the truth. He now knew that Daniel Shaw wasn't just one person, but the head of a network that operated in the shadows, controlling people through fear and manipulation. Megan had uncovered their secrets, and now they were trying to erase both her and Chris from existence. As Chris disappeared into the darkness, he knew he had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless if he wanted to survive. The stakes were higher than ever, but he wasn't going to stop. He was done playing by their rules. Now it was time to flip the game on its head. In the distance, the warehouse lights flickered and went out, leaving only the void of night behind. The hunt was on, and Chris was ready to become the predator. Chapter 8. The Edge of Sanity. Chris had narrowly escaped the warehouse, but he knew the fight was far from over. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to keep moving, but the pain and exhaustion were taking their toll. Blood trickled from his side where he'd been struck, and his vision blurred with every breath. Yet he pressed on, driven by a single thought: find Megan. He staggered through the dark streets, avoiding well-lit areas, and made his way to an old safe house he knew from his past, an abandoned mechanic's garage on the outskirts of town. It was a place no one had touched in years, and Chris hoped it was still off the grid. He forced the rusted door open and slipped inside, bolting it behind him. The garage was cold and damp, the air thick with dust, but it was safe enough for now. He collapsed against a wall, trying to catch his breath. His mind replayed the confrontation at the warehouse. Steele's smug face, the masked men, the ominous warnings. Chris knew that he was in the crosshairs now. They wouldn't stop until both he and Megan were silenced. But he had an advantage. They still underestimated him. They thought they'd broken him, but he was more determined than ever. Chris rifled through the supplies he had stashed in the garage years ago. Spare clothes, a burner phone, a few $1,000s in cash. Like he cleaned his wound as best he could and switched on the burner phone. He needed information, something to help him figure out his next move. The only person who might know how deep this conspiracy went was Laura Barnes. If he could find her, he might be able to piece together the puzzle and figure out what Megan had been planning before she vanished. Chris dialed a number he'd found in Laura's journal, one listed under the name Alice. He wasn't sure if it was even still active, but it was the only lead he had. After a few tense seconds, the line connected. "Hello?" The voice was cautious, almost frightened. "Laura?" Chris asked, his voice low. There was silence on the other end before the woman responded. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Chris. I'm looking for Megan, my wife. I know you met her a few weeks ago. She trusted you." Another pause. Then, "Megan's gone. If you're smart, you'll stop looking and disappear too." Chris felt his frustration boiling over. "I can't do that. They're hunting me, just like they hunted her. I know you've been running too, but if we work together, maybe we can find a way out. Please, I just need to know what she was planning." There was a long silence, and Chris was about to hang up when the voice spoke again, softer this time. "Meet me at the old Redwood Motel, midnight. Come alone, or it's over." The line went dead. Chris stared at the phone, weighing his options. It was clearly a trap. It had to be. But what choice did he have? If Laura was the only one left who knew what Megan had discovered, he couldn't afford to ignore the chance. He just needed to stay one step ahead, turn the trap on whoever set it. As midnight approached, Chris made his way to the Redwood Motel, a crumbling relic on the edge of town, long forgotten by everyone except those with nowhere else to go. The place was bathed in shadows, the neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. He checked his surroundings carefully, scanning for anyone lurking nearby. Satisfied that he wasn't being followed, he headed toward the designated room. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with must and decay. Chris tensed as he stepped inside, his hand hovering near the knife he'd tucked into his waistband. He had no idea who or what was waiting for him. From the darkness, a woman emerged. Her face was gaunt, eyes hollowed from fear and exhaustion. She was in her late 30s, with tangled hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in days. Chris recognized her immediately from the old photos in Laura's journal. This was Laura Barnes. "You really came," she muttered, glancing nervously at the door. "You're either brave or stupid." "Maybe both," Chris replied. "I need answers, Laura. Megan trusted you. I want to know what she found, what you were both running from." Laura eyed him warily, pacing back and forth as if unsure whether she could trust him. Megan was too close to the truth. She thought she could take them down from the inside, Shaw's entire network. But she didn't realize how deep it goes. They own everything. The cops, the politicians, the media. It's not just Brookhaven, it's everywhere. And if they think you're a threat, they make you disappear, just like they did to her. What was she planning? Chris pressed. She left clues, documents, encrypted files. She was trying to expose them. What was the end game? Laura shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. She was going to blow it wide open. There was a meeting scheduled, a summit of sorts, where all the key players were gathering. She planned to go undercover, record everything, and leak it to the press. But they got to her first. I told her it was suicide, but she wouldn't listen. She was willing to sacrifice herself to bring them down. Chris felt a pit form in his stomach. Where is this summit? When is it happening? Laura hesitated, her fear palpable. It's happening in 2 days at an isolated estate outside of town. But you can't go there, Chris. It's a fortress. They'll kill you on sight. Even if you manage to get in, there's no way out. Chris's mind raced. 2 days. That was all the time he had. He couldn't trust the police. Detective Grayson was likely in Shaw's pocket. But he couldn't just sit back and do nothing while Megan was trapped, possibly still alive. He had to take the risk. "I'm going, Laura," Chris said, determination burning in his eyes. "I have nothing left to lose. Megan was willing to put her life on the line, and so am I. You can help me, or you can stay here hiding, but I'm not walking away." Laura stared at him for a long moment, torn between her own fear and a flicker of hope. Finally, she nodded. "There's a way in, a service entrance through the woods. It's not guarded as heavily, but once you're inside, you'll be on your own." Chris's heart raced as the plan began to take shape in his mind. This was it, the final move. Everything hinged on this one chance. If he failed, both he and Megan would be lost forever. But if he succeeded, he could tear down Shaw's network and free them both from the nightmare. As Chris left the motel, the weight of what was to come pressed down on him. The night was growing darker, and he knew that in the coming days he would face dangers more terrifying than anything he'd encountered so far. But he had come too far to turn back now. The clock was ticking. 2 days until the summit. 2 days to find Megan. 2 days to expose the truth. The edge of sanity was near, but Chris was ready to cross it. Chapter 9. The Final Gambit. The mansion loomed before Chris like a dark monolith, its imposing structure bathed in the eerie glow of moonlight. Inside, the summit was reaching its climax, and the room was alive with the hum of whispered conversations and clinking glasses. Chris, hidden in the shadows of the maintenance tunnels, took a moment to steady himself. He and Megan had narrowly escaped the confrontation with Steele, but their reprieve was brief. Laura had led them through the labyrinthine corridors beneath the estate, guiding them towards the heart of the mansion where the summit was taking place. Chris's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. They were close, but every step they took closer to the summit felt like walking into the jaws of a lion. They emerged from the tunnels into a storage room adjacent to the main hall. Laura handed Chris a set of makeshift disguises, simple masks and gloves, to help them blend in with the crowd. Chris carefully dressed Megan in one of the disguises and then donned his own. The masks were far from perfect, but they were better than nothing. They couldn't afford to be recognized. Laura kept watch at the door, her eyes darting nervously as Chris and Megan prepared. "We don't have much time," she whispered. "Once you're in there, keep your head down. Shaw will be at the center of the room. You'll need to get close enough to confront him, but remember, this place is crawling with guards. You need to stay alert." Chris nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Got it. Let's move." They slipped through the door and into the main hall. The room was grand and opulent, with high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of high-stakes conversation. Guests mingled around, their voices rising and falling in a symphony of indifference. Chris scanned the room, his gaze falling on the group at the far end, Shaw and his inner circle. Shaw stood at the center, surrounded by his most trusted allies. He was in the middle of a conversation, his charismatic demeanor in full display. Chris's heart raced as he and Megan made their way through the crowd, keeping to the periphery as they maneuvered closer to Shaw. The masks helped them blend in, but Chris knew that their cover would only last as long as they remained inconspicuous. Megan leaned on Chris, her face pale but determined. "We need to find a way to expose them," she murmured. "They're talking about some sort of final transaction. We need evidence, something concrete that will bring them down." Chris nodded. "I'll get us close. Stay sharp." As they neared Shaw's group, Chris noticed a side table stacked with documents and files, likely evidence of the corruption and manipulation that had plagued their lives. If he could get his hands on those files, it might be enough to turn the tide. He gestured to Megan, indicating that she should stay put while he moved in for the documents. Chris edged closer to the table, his eyes flicking to the guards who patrolled the perimeter. His hands shook slightly as he grabbed a few of the files and tucked them into his jacket. Just as he was about to turn away, a hand gripped his shoulder. "Where do you think you're going?" a deep voice growled. Chris spun around to find himself face to face with one of Shaw's guards. The man's eyes narrowed, suspicion evident. Chris's mind raced. He had to think quickly. "Just getting a drink," Chris said, forcing a casual tone. "The service here is incredible." The guard's gaze lingered on Chris, but before he could question further, Laura appeared beside him. She played the part of a high society guest perfectly, her demeanor confident and composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth and authoritative. The guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under Laura's scrutiny. "No problem," he muttered, stepping back. "Just keep an eye out." With a nod of thanks to Laura, Chris continued his path towards Shaw, thus keeping an eye on the documents he had managed to snatch. He could see Shaw's face clearly now, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of remorse. It was a face that had orchestrated so much suffering, and Chris was determined to make sure it paid. Just then, a commotion broke out at the far end of the hall. Chris's heart skipped a beat as he saw several guests shouting and pointing. He caught a glimpse of a masked figure, a distraction undoubtedly staged by Shaw's people. It was chaos, and it provided the perfect cover for what Chris needed to do next. He grabbed Megan's hand and pulled her towards the chaos, blending in with the panicked crowd. They reached a service exit that led to a smaller, private office, likely Shaw's own. Chris pushed the door open and dragged Megan inside. The room was luxurious, but Chris's focus was solely on the desk. He could see a safe embedded in the wall, its combination lock clearly visible. Laura had joined them in the office, her eyes scanning the room. "This is the best place to make your move," she said. "The safe probably contains all the incriminating evidence you need. I'll keep watch." Chris nodded and moved to the safe. His hands were steady as he worked on the combination, the numbers turning smoothly as he cracked the code. Inside, he found a trove of documents, contracts, records of illegal deals, and photographs of key figures involved in Shaw's network. It was all the evidence they needed to expose the corruption. But before Chris could celebrate, the door burst open. Shaw stood in the doorway, flanked by more guards. His expression was a mix of fury and amusement. "Did you really think you could come in here and take everything from me?" he sneered. Chris grabbed the documents, shoving them into a bag Laura had provided. "We're not done yet, Shaw. You're going to pay for everything you've done." Shaw's eyes gleamed with malice. "You're a fool. You think you can bring me down with these petty documents? The real power is far beyond your reach." Chris didn't wait for another word. He turned to Laura and Megan, urgency in his voice. "We need to get out of here. Now." Laura led the way, guiding them through a series of hidden passages that eventually opened up to a back alley. The night air was cool and refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of the mansion. Chris could hear sirens in the distance, likely the result of the earlier commotion. The evidence was in hand, and with it, they had the means to dismantle Shaw's empire. As they emerged into the alley, Chris took one last look at the mansion. The night had been a whirlwind of danger and deception, but they had succeeded in their mission. The fight wasn't over. Shaw and his network were still out there, but Chris had taken the first step toward justice. He glanced at Megan, her face illuminated by the dim light. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's not over, but we've made a start." Megan nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and resolve. "We have to keep going, for everyone who's been hurt." Chris and Megan, with Laura's help, made their way to safety, knowing that the battle against Shaw's corruption was just beginning. The final gambit had set the stage for the ultimate showdown, a showdown that would determine the fate of their lives and the future of the town. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. The sun was beginning to rise as Chris, Megan, and Laura drove away from the estate. The horizon was painted in hues of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the chaos and darkness they had left behind. The documents they had secured were safely tucked away, but the real battle was just beginning. They needed to get the evidence to the right people and ensure Shaw's network was dismantled once and for all. Chris was driving, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Megan sat beside him, her head resting against the window as she tried to recover from the ordeal. Laura, in the back seat, was constantly checking their surroundings, her nerves still on edge. The atmosphere in the car was tense, charged with the weight of their actions and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As they drove toward the city, Chris turned to Megan. "We need to find a way to get this evidence into the hands of the authorities, but we have to be smart about it. Shaw has eyes everywhere." Megan nodded, her expression resolute. "I agree. We need to make sure it's handled by someone who's completely trustworthy, someone who won't be bought off or intimidated." Laura spoke up from the back seat. "I might have a contact who can help. She's an investigative journalist with a reputation for taking down corrupt officials. If anyone can get this story out there and make sure it sticks, it's her." Chris glanced at Laura through the rearview mirror. "Do you trust her?" Laura hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, I do. Her name is Emily Carter. She's been working on similar cases for years and has a track record of exposing high-level corruption. If anyone can make a difference, it's her." Chris nodded. "All right, let's get to her as quickly as we can." The drive to Emily's office took over an hour. The city was just waking up, and the streets were relatively clear. As they arrived at the building where Emily worked, Chris could feel the tension building again. They were about to hand over everything they had fought for, and there was no turning back. Laura led the way, guiding Chris and Megan into the building and up to Emily's office. The walls were lined with newspaper clippings and awards, a testament to Emily's success as a journalist. The door to her office was slightly ajar, and Laura knocked gently before entering. Inside, Emily Carter was seated behind her desk, her eyes focused intently on her computer screen. She was a woman in her early 40s with a sharp, intelligent gaze and an air of authority. When she looked up and saw Laura, she immediately rose from her chair. "Laura, it's good to see you," Emily said, her voice warm but professional. "What's going on? You look like you've been through the ringer." Laura quickly introduced Chris and Megan, explaining the situation and the evidence they had recovered. Emily listened attentively, her expression growing more serious as the details unfolded. When Laura finished, Emily's eyes turned to Chris. "So, you have everything we need to take down Shaw's network?" Chris nodded, handing over the bag with the documents. "Yes, everything you need is in there. It's all solid evidence of their corruption and illegal activities. We need to get this out to the public and make sure Shaw and his associates are held accountable." Emily took the bag and began to sift through the documents, her eyes scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. "This is a gold mine," she said finally, looking up at Chris. "This will blow the story wide open. But I need to verify everything, cross-check the information, and make sure it's airtight before we go public. It's a lot of work, but I promise you, I'll make sure it gets out there." Chris felt a sense of relief, but also a pang of anxiety. "How long will that take?" Emily considered this for a moment. "A few days at the most. I'll need to get it to my sources, prepare a detailed report, and make sure we're ready for any backlash. But I'll keep you updated every step of the way." With a nod, Chris and Megan took a seat in the waiting area while Emily and Laura continued discussing the details. As the minutes ticked by, Chris glanced at Megan. She looked exhausted, but relieved, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and apprehension. "This is it," Chris said quietly, taking Megan's hand. "We've done everything we can. Now it's up to Emily to get this out there and ensure justice is served." Megan squeezed his hand. "I know, and whatever happens, we've fought for what's right. We've done everything we could." After a while, Laura returned to the waiting area, her expression serious. "Emily's going to start working on the story immediately. She said she'll get in touch with us once she's made progress. We should lay low for a bit, just in case Shaw's people try to come after us." Chris nodded, knowing that staying hidden was the best course of action for now. They thanked Emily and left Iskinski after meeting the weight of their mission still heavy on their shoulders. As they walked back to their car, Chris couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here, the twists and turns, the betrayals and sacrifices. But through it all, they had persevered. They had taken down a corrupt empire and had a chance to rebuild their lives. Back at their temporary safe house, Chris and Megan settled in, the quiet of their surroundings a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. As night fell, Chris looked at Megan and saw the exhaustion etched on her face. He knew the coming days would be challenging, but they had made it this far. The final battle was over, and the fight for justice was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Emily worked tirelessly, preparing the exposé and ensuring that the evidence would withstand scrutiny. The story broke wide open, and the public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Shaw's network began to unravel, with arrests and investigations following in quick succession. As the dust began to settle, Chris and Megan found a sense of peace that had been elusive for so long. They knew there would still be challenges ahead, but they faced them together, knowing they had made a difference. Their lives were far from perfect, but they had reclaimed their sense of justice and had given others the chance to fight for theirs. Chris looked at Megan, his heart full of gratitude and love. They had survived the storm and emerged stronger on the other side. And as they looked forward to their new beginning, they knew that the fight for truth and justice was an ongoing journey, one they were ready to face together. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.